Hello and welcome to Drew Yaps. My last video, I talked about some books, and now I really want to talk about more. I have a lot of books to talk about, but they're going to be quicker. I also want to say my last episode, I'm very happy with it. Where I was talking about the Goodreads Choice Award winners. My original plan was to read all 10 and talk about all of them. And then I read five, and then they were good books, but I just didn't really feel like reading any more of them. I kind of started with the ones that interested me the most. I don't know if I'm ever gonna do a part two. It might just be those five. Um, and I'm okay with that. The only thing is I didn't feel like recording something for the end to like explain it. So just like if I don't, I'm not totally re remembering, but I think it just like ends after the fifth one, and then it's like that's it. There you go. So anyway, if you want to hear like really in-depth like actual yapping about books, then that episode is a great one. This episode, what's kind of inspired this is I just gave my first ever one-star review, 1 out of 5, on Goodreads. And I was excited about that because now I've given at least one book each rating, you know? So I decided, I went ahead and I read a book that I thought I would probably end up giving 1 star. I almost always read books that I think I'll like, but I decided to do a hate read because I was inspired by a YouTuber I like. So I read 13 Reasons Why. I did, in fact, give it 1 star, and I wanted to talk about it on Drew Yaps, but then I wrote my review, and I'm really happy with the way I explained everything. So I decided what I'm gonna do instead of just doing like a Drew Yaps episode about the book 13 Reasons Why, which also is something that even though I do feel like I have things to say about the book, this book has been dissected so much. I mean, it's also incredibly popular. I was sort of shocked by how high the score is on Goodreads. Like it's 3.84 out of 5 stars with over a million ratings, and there's only 4% 1 star reviews, which is kind of crazy to me because I feel like this genuinely has like harmful messaging. So anyway, what I decided I'm going to do is I'm just going to read word for word, for the most part, my review I wrote of 13 Reasons Why, and then I'm just going to go ahead and read all the reviews I've written so far. I have 37 reviews, but the 5 reviews that I wrote for the Goodreads Choice Award books, I'm not going to read those. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, just go watch that episode. So that's 32, which does sound like a lot, but you can watch as much or as little as you want. And also, generally these reviews shouldn't take me too long to get through. This will definitely end up being one of maybe my longest episode, but yeah, I don't know, just listen to it or don't. I'm gonna talk about a bunch of books, and I'm mostly gonna read my reviews, and then sometimes I'll probably interject with other thoughts that I didn't include. So I'm just gonna get right into my review of 13 Reasons Why. I have my reviews sorted from lowest score to highest, but uh if there's multiple books with the same score, then it's just going to be put in like a random order. So, it's not like this is in order from my like 32nd favorite all the way to my first favorite. It's mostly in a random order, but it'll get higher as it goes. So, 13 Reasons Why. Every rating, the 1 through 5 1 out of 5 stars. Wow. I gave like a description for what it means. So I'll only read that the first time it comes up. So for 1 out of 5 stars, my description of a 1 out of 5 star book is this is a bad book that shouldn't exist. And here's my review of 13 Reasons Why, which I still feel very passionate about because I just wrote this review. This is not a good book. In fact, I think it's dangerous. The intended messaging seems to be something along the lines of treat others kindly because you don't know what they're going through, and open up to others and give them a chance to help you, but the story ends up communicating a much more damaging and scary message. I also want to interject here real quick and say that some of these books are going to deal with some serious topics, so I'll try and warn you a little bit. So this book is about suicide, so if you don't want to hear me talk about that, then, you can skip this part. I honestly have no idea if I'm going to put timestamps in the description or not, but I'm not going to get too graphic with anything I talk about. I mostly give general thoughts on things, and nothing I talk about should be too extreme. Like, you can probably handle anything that I'm going to say. Anyway, Hannah Baker is a character who experiences a lot of upsetting things in high school and slowly gets more depressed until she ends up taking her own life. This book takes place after Hannah has already committed suicide. She recorded tapes explaining the 13 reasons why she did so, and each person talked about on the tapes gets a turn to listen to them. We see the way this affects these characters, and the intention is clearly for everyone to realize what they've done wrong. This is made clear with this quote from the main character, Clay. He says, those of us on the tapes, we can't go back either. We can never not find a package on our doorstep or in our mailbox. From that moment on, we're different. Clay is essentially telling the reader that these tapes and Hannah's suicide have left a permanent impact on the people who wronged her, and this is a very harmful message to spread in the way that it's spread. As someone who has dealt with suicidal thoughts, I know that one of the most enticing ideas of suicide is the thought that it's such a big and upsetting thing that it forces the people who hurt you to reconsider things. This book contributes to that idea, and in that way, it begins to unintentionally glorify suicide. The messaging in this book is extremely shallow. If you've read the book, you know exactly what I mean. Because of this, the book feels like it's aimed toward a very young audience, and the author, Jay Asher, describes this as a teen novel. This makes the romanticization of suicide even worse because young teen readers would likely be less critical and more influenced by the messaging in the book. I suspect the people who liked this book the most were young suicidal teenagers, and I'm afraid of what this book could have done to my perception of suicide if I read it at a younger age. On the subject of shallow writing, Clay is almost entirely pointless as a main character. J. Asher knows that his readers are primarily only reading to find out about the titular 13 reasons, and because of this, Clay only really exists as a way to deliver Hannah's story. We're occasionally given bits of characterization, and he sometimes interacts with his peers, but even then, it's really just to help us understand what Clay thought about Hannah and what Hannah thought about Clay. Clay has so many strange thoughts that never get countered later in the book. He idolizes Hannah and puts her on a pedestal, and that never fully stops. He does things like saying that Hannah didn't need makeup and then being shocked when she reveals that she did wear makeup. And there are so many things like that example that are not only an extremely shallow way of communicating a message to the reader, but also show that Clay is kind of obsessed with Hannah, and that's never really portrayed as being a problem. The worst part of Clay's obsession with Hannah is his insistence that he is the only one who could have saved her. Here's an example, but there are a lot more. He says, I left her alone in that room, the only person who might have been able to reach out and save her from herself, to pull her back from wherever she was heading. This really bothers me. First of all, Clay didn't really get to know Hannah until a few months before she committed suicide, and even then, he didn't know her very well. They made out at a party, but other than that, they barely interacted. I understand that part of it is the guilt that people tend to feel after someone takes their own life, but it's crazy to me that this guy who barely knew Hannah is so convinced that he's the only person who could save her. And what's worse is that the book seems to agree with this, because it never counters Clay's ideas. You see, Clay is talked about in the tapes. That's why he was given them, but not because he hurt her like everyone else she talks about. No, it's because he's so perfect and nice. She talks about how she was interested in him for a long time and never heard or discovered anything bad about him. Everyone at school thinks he's so great, and so does she. She's so happy with him at the party where they end up making out, and she only pushes him away because she's afraid that Clay will hurt her like so many other men have. This isn't inherently a bad plot point, but it ends up validating every weird thought that Clay has both before and after this point, and he also just goes through no character arc. It's okay that he idolizes her because she seems to feel the same way. The author might genuinely want you to think that Clay is the only person who could save her because he's the only person she doesn't have bad things to say about. This is so stupid. First of all, this sort of implies that the people who have hurt her can't have a change of heart and help her. If Clay is the only one who could save Hannah because he's the only one who didn't do bad things to her, then that means that everyone else is stuck as a bad person and can't make things up to her. On the contrary, if someone who hurt her in the past had apologized and tried to make things up to her, I think that would have been more helpful than Clay just being like the perfect boyfriend or whatever could have happened between them. Instead, the book basically just says that these people can't change until after Hannah has died. My other issue with this is the idea that the responsibility of saving Hannah lies on somebody other than her. It's a very emotionally harmful mindset to feel like you are the only one keeping someone alive, and I don't want anyone to think that that's the way it should be. People can help Hannah, but the final responsibility lies in her own choice to help herself. Other people can't help Hannah unless she lets them. Clay even acknowledges how Hannah didn't let him help her, but still thinks that he's the only one who could fix things. It's important to treat people with kindness and to not contribute to their trauma, but no matter what we do, the decision not to commit suicide is always going to be a personal, individual choice. Finally, I don't like the way this book is written. That's partially because this is a book aimed at a younger audience, but I also have some fundamental issues with the structure of this book. Jay Asher generally wants to keep the dialogue from Hannah's tapes going at all times because that's what keeps the reader going, but he also has to continually remind you that Clay is technically the main character. Asher does this by having every paragraph or so of Hannah's dialogue be interrupted by narration from Clay. Occasionally, this works well. When Hannah is actually talking about Clay, it is somewhat interesting to get both of their perspectives at the same time. But for the most part, this structure sucks. Clay's parts are essentially written like you would expect from any novel, with descriptions of his actions and the things going on around him. However, because they're all broken up, these descriptions go from slightly unnecessary to entirely annoying. You don't need to interrupt Hannah's story to tell me that a random car drives by. I don't care that Clay's coffee is getting cold. I just want to hear the rest of what Hannah has to say. There's one particularly big issue that this causes, and I'm going to give a specific example to illustrate it. At one point, Hannah is recounting a traumatic event that occurred at an ice cream shop. Clay has a map and has been going around town to all the different places that Hannah talks about. However, if Clay was at the ice cream shop as soon as that tape started, then there would be very little that he could interject with. So instead, the story also describes his journey to get there. This would be fine in a typical story, but not here. What ends up happening is that Hannah tells her story while we get little descriptions of every couple of paragraphs explaining what Clay is doing and how he's traveling to the ice cream shop. Then, halfway through Hannah's story, Clay arrives. When he arrives, he gives an in depth description of what the ice cream store looks like and what's going on inside. This is a common practice in writing because it helps the reader picture the environment as the story goes on. However, because of how this book is written, we're already halfway through Hannah's events taking place in this ice cream shop. At this point, I've already had to come up with my own picture of the ice cream shop, so I don't want to be interrupted with two paragraphs explaining what it actually looks like. It makes sense from a writing standpoint, but it doesn't work because it comes too late. This book is poorly written, it has lots of concerning and or problematic ideas that go unchecked, and it presents a dangerously glorified view of suicide to a young audience. I do not think this book should exist, and I do not think it was worth reading, but I won't deny that it was a fun hate read. So that's my thoughts on 13 Reasons Why. Now we're moving on to the only book so far that I've given 2 out of 5 stars, which this one may be a little controversial. Also, I just want to say most of my reviews are not as long as that one. But this 2 out of 5 star review is for The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. And my explanation for 2 out of 5 stars is that any book I give 2 out of 5 stars generally falls under this. I understand why this book exists, but I don't like it. I'm probably not the right audience for it. So here's my review. I just read this book for the second time after hating it the first time, and my opinion has only slightly changed. It's not a bad book, but it absolutely bores me to death. I almost gave this book 3 stars, but I just couldn't quite bring myself to do it. First, let me say some positive things. This is a well written book. H.G. Wells is a good writer who puts a lot of thought into his descriptions. This book feels like a very realistic depiction of an alien invasion, and that's why so many people love it. It seems like he thought, what would happen if Martians invaded Earth and you were just some random dude, and then wrote it down. The main character is intelligent, but he doesn't have any real relevant skills or knowledge related to the situation. He doesn't even have that much of an established personality or background. He's just some random guy running around trying to survive. The explanations of each situation, the Martian technology, and the Martians themselves are all very thoroughly thought out and show how much work Wells put into this book. It's all very logical. The conclusion to the Martian invasion, while not the most exciting plot point, does again feel quite logical, and it's something that I wouldn't have considered otherwise. But now I need to complain. I'm glad this book exists, but I never want to read it ever again. It's just a few hundred pages of some random guy running away from aliens while everybody dies, and then the ending is not very exciting either. I think it's cool how the main character is essentially just a random civilian, but I'm given no real reason to care about him aside from his status as the main character. We're not shown a whole lot about who he is as a person, he doesn't have that many interesting interactions with people, and there weren't any relationships that I really cared about. I really enjoy Jane Austen's novels, which many people would argue also struggle from having boring plots, but the difference for me is the focus on relationships. Romance novels like Jane Austen writes don't necessarily have the most gripping plots, but they have such intricately formed relationships with interesting people that I can't help but continue reading to find out what happens to them. I read for the characters more than the events. And that's why I find this book so boring. It's also an intricately planned story with a well thought out plot, but the thought went into the descriptions of the aliens and their technology rather than the relationships. For some people, that's a great thing. If you love science fiction and want to read a realistic depiction of an alien invasion, I'd recommend reading this book. It's a classic and will likely give you what you're looking for, but it doesn't align enough with my interests or what I'm looking for from a book for me to really enjoy it. And that's War of the Worlds. My next book is Mansfield Park, which is the first of three books that I've given 3 stars. Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. So 3 out of 5 stars has the longest explanation of what it means because it. Oh wow, the rain's really picking up. It has the longest explanation of what it could mean because it's kind of got two main different things. Um, so I said 3 out of 5 stars falls under this umbrella. This is a decent book. There are two potential reasons. Wow. There are two potential reasons I may give a book 3 stars. Option one, I feel pretty indifferent about it. It didn't particularly interest me, but I also didn't find it particularly boring. Option two, there were some really good things and some really bad things about this book. I can't bring myself to rate this book lower because of the good parts, but I also can't rate it higher because of the bad parts. This book, this review will have some spoilers. I generally mostly try to avoid spoilers in my book reviews unless it's really relevant to what I have to say. So there's certain things like you'll notice in the War of the Worlds review, I didn't explain how the aliens died. So I'm mostly just gonna read it as is, and I'll tell you if there's spoilers or not. Um, so this not everything is going to make 100% sense if you haven't read the books, but I think it should still be, fairly understandable. So here is my 3 out of 5 star review of Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This is the only Jane Austen novel that didn't blow me away. I haven't written reviews for most of Jane Austen's other books as of writing this one, but I'd give all the other ones 5 out of 5 stars. However, I still enjoyed this book overall. I listened to an audiobook narrated by Karen Savage for a large portion of the book, and she read it very well. I'm going to do my best to avoid most spoilers, but I'm definitely going to spoil some parts of the book. Overall, I liked Fanny Price as a main character. I think she gets more hate than she deserves. In my mind, she's kind of a more mature version of Catherine Morland from Northanger Abbey. She's kind, mature, pretty, intelligent, and soft spoken. I don't know what more you could want from a teenage girl in the 1800s. I understand people who don't like how much she complains about her home, but when you've spent the last half of your life in a much more controlled and sophisticated environment, the shock of returning home is understandable. Sure, Fanny's not as good of a heroine as someone like Elizabeth Bennet or as entertaining as someone like Emma Woodhouse, but that's a lot to live up to. I also don't hate the other characters as much as some people do. Yes, they all have their flaws and kind of suck in their own way, and yes, Mrs. Norris is the absolute most deplorable character in any Jane Austen book, but that's all by design. We're supposed to see these characters' flaws in order to give us even more respect for Fanny not being like them. The point of the story is how Fanny teaches them just as much as they teach her. I particularly enjoy the character growth of Sir Thomas Bertram. Edmund isn't as great as some of the other men in Jane Austen novels, but I still appreciate him. The main reason this book got 3 stars instead of a higher ranking is because there wasn't really any main plot point that really spoke to me or felt particularly profound. More specifically, the one plot point that I did find profound was not developed in the way I hoped it would be. This is where I'm going to have to spoil some of the story. I think the book should have been focused much more on Henry Crawford instead of Edmund. I know that Henry is fairly significant in the book, but I think he should have been the primary love interest. Although, as I'll explain in a moment, that may not be the best descriptor for what I want his character to be. The idea of Henry being a great, charismatic guy who Fanny has no reason to dislike, and yet she just can't bring herself to love him, is a powerful and profound idea that's different from any of Jane Austen's other novels. That's one of the many things I love about Jane Austen. All of her other books focus on a different aspect of romance, which makes each story feel very unique. This book was basically just Fanny loves someone and she keeps loving him until he loves her. Sure, that persistent love can be powerful, but at that point it's almost just a less emotionally impactful version of persuasion. I think Henry Crawford should have been introduced to Fanny much sooner. Maybe the Bertrams, in an attempt to help Fanny, try and set her up with Henry. This would obviously take some effort and other changes to make it work logically for the plot, but I think it could work. Then the story would be about Fanny being given the option to marry a man who is both charismatic and part of a higher society, and yet she still can't find it in herself to love him. In my opinion, the way to truly make this a profound story is to make Henry Crawford an undeniably good choice for a love interest. I want most readers to like Henry Crawford and to not understand why Fanny doesn't love him. That would really be making a statement. This quote from the book alone proves my point about the profound quality of Henry's relationship with Fanny. Fanny Price says, I should have thought that every woman must have felt the possibility of a man's not being approved, not being loved by someone of her sex at least, let him be so ever generally agreeable. Let him have all the perfections in the world, I think it ought not to be set down as certain that a man must be acceptable to every woman he may happen to like himself. Instead, the main love interest is Edmund. Edmund, who doesn't love Fanny until his first choice is no longer an option. I like Edmund, but he's nowhere near as interesting and doesn't make much of a statement. Henry starts to develop as a character, but in the end, his lustful nature wins over and he loses Fanny forever. It feels like Henry was added to the story to provide poetic justice rather than to leave a lasting impact on the reader, and I can't say that Edmund left a particularly lasting impact either. I did enjoy this book. Jane Austen was a talented writer, and I enjoy seeing what life was like in this time period. However, as I said many times in this review, this book didn't make much of a profound statement about romance, and it didn't leave that big of an impression. I wouldn't advise against reading this novel, but I would advise reading all of Jane Austen's other novels first. If this book was rewritten in the way I suggested, I truly think it could be another 5 out of 5 star book. Maybe I should email Jane Austen. So that's Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. The next book, which is also has spoilers, is a 3 out of 5 star review of The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. I honestly, actually, no, I say this in the review. So I'm just going to start. Here is The Fault in Our Stars. This is a good example of what a 3 star book is for me. I don't feel like I wasted my time reading it, but I also didn't get that much out of it. Considering the popularity of this book, I expected something much better. I've read Turtles All the Way Down, and it was written much better than this book. This book is very cheesy, but first I'd like to start with the positives. This book is close to being 2 out of 5 stars for me, but I'm still going to try and say some positive things about it. The biggest strength of this book is that John Green is incredibly smart. Because of this, he's able to provide a lot of interesting information in relation to cancer, among other things. That makes the book more engrossing and educational. He also does sometimes capture aspects of humanity that are decently thought provoking. The story is somewhat emotionally impactful. However, I don't view this as a particularly strong aspect of the book. It's really only emotionally impactful because it's about 2 people getting cancer, falling in love, and dying, more or less. That is an inherently emotional subject and doesn't necessarily mean the book is actually written well or particularly thoughtful. And unfortunately, the book is not written very well. As I said before, it's very cheesy. I can get over cheesy writing to a degree, but it does take away from the overall experience of the book. John Green seems to have a pretty weak understanding of what women actually experience when they're in love, and I would know because I've read Jane Austen. At times, the main character feels quite shallow because of the writing, and to a degree, she is. In all fairness, she is a teenager, but shallow writing leads to shallow characters. Like, what is this? He smirked at me. I shoved his upper arm playfully. I could feel the muscle right beneath the skin, all tense and amazing. What woman actually thinks like this? To end with a positive thought, I really liked the character of Peter Van Houten. He's a very rude person, but he's undeniably smart and proposes some genuinely intriguing questions about the nature of art. I wish the main characters had given a bit more thought to the things he said, but he said it in such a rude way that I don't blame them. If the book had focused more on that, it would be a lot more interesting, but then it would no longer be focused on cancer. Overall, this book was a letdown, but I don't regret reading it. There were some sweet moments, and it wasn't a bad depiction of life and love with cancer. However, I would be unlikely to recommend it to most people, and I don't plan to come back to it or to watch the movie. The last book I gave 3 out of 5 stars is 1984 by George Orwell. Now this is a controversial one among my friends because I have some friends that really like 1984. I just don't. I don't. I think it's the philosophy is very interesting. I think the book is not very good. So I've had some arguments over this. So this is going to be a longer review. So we'll just get right into it. I really didn't expect this to be one of my lowest rated books, but I don't get the hype. Part of that may be because I'm reading this immediately after Brave New World, which was incredible, but my opinions stand without comparing this novel to others. I think this book deserves appreciation for its social commentary. I probably even agree with the opinion that this is one of the essential dystopian novels, but it's not because it's particularly good as a story. First, I want to start with the positives. It's clear that George Orwell has put a lot of thought into this world and the mechanics that make an all powerful government like this work. It's very thoroughly explained and at times can be enlightening. There are a lot of thought provoking ideas presented in this book. I don't really have any issues with the logic of this book, and the technology all seems relatively plausible, especially in our modern era of AI. They wouldn't even need actual humans to fabricate photos, videos, and the like. There are also a lot of good moral dilemmas in this story. Obviously, there's the overarching dilemma of whether or not Winston should rebel against the party. I think that idea is explored pretty well. There's also a new form of this moral dilemma when Winston has to decide if he should give in to the party while being tortured. The discussion of what Winston and Julia are willing to do for the Brotherhood is interesting, and I like how Julia and Winston betray each other in the end. This one has spoilers too. I forgot to mention that, but hopefully that's obvious because it's a 3 out of 5 star book and they all have spoilers. I do like the ending. It ended how I expected and hoped it would. Julia was apathetic about taking down the party, but strong in her love for Winston. Winston loved Julia too, and even said he'd be willing to choose the Brotherhood over her, but at the end of the day, the most important thing to him was rebelling against the party. In the end, Julia betrays Winston, and Winston loves Big Brother. They both lost what was most important to them, and that is powerfully bleak. Finally, I think the Brotherhood is the best part of the novel. I love how it's left ambiguous whether or not it actually exists. In all likelihood, I think it does exist to a degree, but it doesn't matter because the party is so powerful. Additionally, I think making the thought of organized rebellion have such little impact on the actual events of the story is an interesting concept, even if it doesn't make for an exciting story. The only thing the idea of the Brotherhood really accomplishes is getting Winston and Julia captured. The government spreading the idea of a rebellious organization that doesn't really exist, at least not to the scale it's portrayed as, in order to catch thought criminals is a fascinating concept and something I'd never thought about. However, just like, or as you're going to see later on, how I was able to write basically an entire essay complaining about it and still really enjoy the book, I can also write a lot of positive things about 1984 and still think it's not a very good book. This book is a great example of how you can have lots of really good ideas and still not make a really good novel. As I previously said, this book is full of great social commentary and well thought out ideas. However, it doesn't work very well as a story. The primary issue is simply that the book has so much exposition, and particularly that it all gets crammed together. The story starts off slow. You'll notice my section on the positives doesn't mention much from the first section of the book, but you expect things to pick up once Winston starts rebelling and then quote unquote joins the Brotherhood. However, once this happens, we then have to deal with Goldstein's book, or Goldstein, I'm going to say Goldstein. Goldstein's book is a book that all members of the Brotherhood are expected to read. It details the ideologies of the current world in order to provide a better understanding of why things are the way they are, and then contrast that with the views of how the Brotherhood could change things to free society and improve the quality of life. This is essential knowledge for Winston's character, but it's not plot, it's exposition. Therefore, the more of it that gets put in the novel, the more it will slow down the pace of the plot. And guess what? We get 35 straight pages of this book. 35 pages of nothing but exposition. That's more than 10% of the novel. And immediately after this, Winston and Julia get captured, and we find out that the guy who gave Winston the book is actually part of the Thought Police. So, what was the point? But hey, at least we made it past the slowest part of the plot, right? Right? Wrong! I wrote it in all caps, so I feel like I have to yell it. Winston is now captured and starts getting tortured as a method of getting him to change his ideology, essentially. You'd think that would be a relatively short portion of the novel, or maybe it would have some action during it. Perhaps he might even try to escape or fight back against the people torturing him. But no, Orwell instead uses this as an opportunity for more exposition and philosophical discussion. In fact, it's just about another 35 pages of it. That's more than 10% of the novel again. 35 pages of O'Brien asking a question, electrocuting Winston after getting an unsatisfactory answer, and then answering the question himself in long monologues. I will state one more time that this exposition is thought provoking. It's well written from a philosophical standpoint, but it is not good for the story. It slows things down so much. In fact, when it comes to Goldstein's book, it literally forces the story to a complete stop. You can't make a book where almost a fourth of it is massive exposition dumps and still write a compelling, eventful story. If I was someone who was capable of quitting reading in the middle of a book, I would have considered doing so. The story was slow at the start, but in a way that felt like it was building to something. Things got slightly more interesting with Winston and Julia's romance, but it still wasn't a particularly compelling plotline. They finally decided to do something other than have sex and read 35 pages of Goldstein's book and immediately get captured. Now that they're actually somewhere interesting, the book decides to keep Winston in one room for another 35 pages while O'Brien yaps on and on to Winston, or Winston yaps on and on in his thoughts. Then, at last, the final 30 pages are an enjoyable ending, but it was such a chore to get there that very little tension has actually been built up, and therefore the payoff at the conclusion is dulled. At the end of the day, I'm glad I read the book, if for no other reason than that it's a classic and culturally relevant. I understand this book is intentionally dreary and shows how any attempt to stop a government like this is futile, but there are much better ways to do this while still writing a good story, and I'm now obliged to point out that that is almost exactly what Brave New World does. George Orwell should have just written some sort of philosophy book and forgotten about fiction. Whether or not the narrative version of Orwell's ideas is worth reading is up to you, but I think it's probably worth it. And that's the end of the 3-star books. So the next two 4-star books are Not Quite Dead Yet by Holly Jackson and The Compound by, I'm not going to try and pronounce that name, but both of those books are ones I talked about in my other episode, the Goodreads Choice Award. So I'm going to skip them and go straight on to one of the other, like, most recent books I've read. I read this one about a month ago. So I guess I've read a fair few books since, but still, this is a 4 out of 5-star book, and it is You by Caroline Kepnes. Um, so 4 out of 5 stars falls under the umbrella of this is a very good book, but it didn't stand out to me as much as it could have. I will still look back on the book fondly, but won't think about it as much as the 5-star books. Now, I don't remember exactly what I talk about in this review. Like I said, I'm never going to get into anything too like graphic or detailed, but this book does have some violence and stalking and sexual content. So I probably don't mention it very much. This is a pretty short review. Um, but we'll see what happens. So yeah, this is my 4 out of 5 star review of You. This was a great book. It's a pretty quick read that does a great job of building tension. I enjoyed the whole book, but the last 100 pages or so were particularly great. That section starts with an amazing portion where everything seems fine, but you can tell that something's off. It's really well done and feels very tense. Then when things finally come crashing down, it's very shocking and intense. And the ending is a great conclusion to the mental unraveling we see throughout the story. I watched all 5 seasons of the show about a year ago, but the plot twist still had me riveted. If you've seen the show, I think there are still good reasons to read the book. Firstly, I think it's always good to see where the show came from and read the story in its original intended form. Additionally, while the plot is generally the same, there are enough differences between the show and the book to still make things feel interesting and new. I think the story was changed and adapted really well for the show, but I also think the original plot works better for the book. So both versions are great. Joe is an incredibly interesting character to read about. His perspective is fascinating. I always enjoy well written books that capture a narrator's slow descent into insanity slash spiral of degenerating mental health. It was very effectively written in this story, and I love how subtly it's done. Joe clearly has issues from the beginning, but when you compare it to the end of the book, you can see how he has very slowly gotten worse and worse throughout the story. It's gradual and realistic. The plot itself is highly engrossing. There's enough action to really stick with you while still taking time to develop each character and make them feel real. Joe's hypocrisy is especially interesting, seeing the ways he judges others for things he's also guilty of. I also love how all of the characters in this story are flawed. In just about any other book, Beck would not be a particularly likable or sympathetic character, but Joe's thoughts and actions change her effect on the story. We come to realize that Beck is a very flawed person, but she's still not as bad as Joe. This is a really interesting point that the book brings up. People can be flawed and potentially even a bad person, but that doesn't mean they deserve for something horrible like this to happen to them. The main thing that bothered me, I guess, with this book is that it is incredibly sexual. However, that's not necessarily a flaw because that is one of the main points of the book. The sexual aspects are an important part of the plot and a way to show the motivations and flaws of different characters. While I don't really like reading spicy things, I can still appreciate the purpose of this, and it didn't bother me as much as it has in other books. But if you're going to read this, you should still be that it is oh my goodness. You should still be aware that it is very sexual, at least by my standards. If you know what you're getting yourself into and you enjoy thrillers, I would recommend this book. It's an intriguing story that dives into the mind of an obsessive stalker and touches on the lack of privacy that has come out of the evolution of social media. If you enjoyed the show, you should read the book, and if you enjoyed the book, you should watch the show. Just prepare yourself for how sexual it is. The next 4 star review is one that I mentioned earlier, which is Turtles All the Way Down. But I also want to quickly say that last review, for those of you who have been around for a little while, my second episode of Drew Yaps, which my goodness, that was like 4 episodes ago, was about like the first scene in the TV show for you. So that was kind of what kicked off my interest in reading the book, and then I finally read it recently. So, here's Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. I have quite a few. I haven't done this as much recently, but I used to start a lot of my reviews with a quote from the book. So I started this with the quote: "The problem with happy endings is that they're either not really happy or not really endings." I couldn't quite bring myself to give this 5 stars, but it was a beautiful story. I honestly don't know what to say about this book, so this will probably be a shorter review. This book follows a girl named Aza who struggles with ideas of consciousness and identity, as well as with anxiety and self harm. We see the way that her anxiety and mental struggles torment her and cause harm to both herself and those around her. Her best friend, Daisy, is a very real character. I've had a friend like that, somebody who stuck by me in my darkest moments, was honest with me even if it hurt, and always told me to stop apologizing. She's not perfect, but she's a good friend. David is an interesting character. Every interaction he has with Asa feels quite realistic, particularly the moments where they talk about how their relationship isn't going to work, but I won't spoil whether or not it does work. Those moments were so real and relatable that they hurt to read. The ending is bittersweet in just the right way, although personally I think it would have been even better if the final chapter was just cut out. I think it captured all of the important main ideas of the story. I could tell from the start that this book was going to straddle the line between profound and cheesy, but I think it managed to consistently avoid slipping into cringeworthy territory. There were a lot of good thoughts and quotes from this book, and I had to resist putting most of them in this review so you could read them yourself. If you can handle some strong language, a bit of saucy dialogue, and a whole lot of emotions, then I recommend reading this book. This is the first book I've read by John Green, and I'm intrigued. Unfortunately, that led to me deciding to read The Fault in Our Stars, which I did not enjoy as much. But that's really all I had to say. Some of the 4-star reviews are going to be decently short because it's just like the book was good, and that's that. So, my next 4-star review is The Chance by Karen Kingsbury. This was a very enjoyable book. It honestly ended up being a lot more emotionally heavy than I expected, but I liked that, and it still has a happy ending. There are definitely a lot of miracles that lead to a happy ending. That could be an issue for some people, but it's also a reminder of how great God can be. Not everyone will experience as many miracles as the characters do in this book, and not everyone will have practically every single one of their problems solved in such a short time like the characters in this book, but that doesn't make the story less wholesome. Anything is possible with God, and this story is a somewhat extreme example of that. There, if you've read this book, there are a lot of very big miracles. The characters are pretty interesting and complex in this story. You see how misunderstandings and assumptions in some ways are just as damaging to relationships as actual intentional acts of harm. The characters love and care about each other, but the more they hurt each other, either intentionally or unintentionally, the less they understand each other. It takes a long time for them to come back together and try to gain that understanding and apologize, but we see that it's never too late to reconcile with someone. The romance in the story is very sweet. The two main characters have a complicated relationship, but they also show an unconditional love that's very wholesome and Christ-like. The main character's parents also seem to have a genuine love that has gone through a lot of difficulties. In addition to the romance, the love the characters have for their children is equally wholesome. The issues addressed in this book are done in a pretty realistic and thought-provoking way. The main character's struggles with her faith are interesting and show the importance of being surrounded by people who will motivate you to grow in your faith. The main character's father has possibly the most interesting struggle of the story. He causes severe emotional harm to his wife and daughter and is the one who pushes them away in the end, and it takes him a long time to realize that. It's nice to see the genuine change in his character once he realizes that and the way he acknowledges the misuse of his Christian beliefs. As with the other Karen Kingsbury book I read, which will be next, there were some pretty extreme and unexpected miracles that led to the conclusion, but that doesn't ruin the story. Most people are not going to experience such quick and profound change, but these stories are still a reminder that it's possible. Just remember that God is always working in your life, even if it's in seemingly small ways. If this book sounds like something you'd enjoy, I would recommend reading it. And the other Karen Kingsbury book, which I also gave 4 out of 5 stars, is Unlocked by Karen Kingsbury. I usually start with the positives and then explain why I took stars away, but I think for this book it's important to start with the criticisms. I also feel it's necessary to provide a warning that this book does contain a fairly upsetting suicide scene, but I'm not going to discuss that in my review. Since I didn't discuss it, I do just want to say here it's it's interesting to me because I it's not I don't think it's inherently wrong to depict suicide in your story, but I do think that it was an unnecessary detail that doesn't contribute that much to the main storyline. And I also think particularly because it's unnecessary, it's a bit too graphic. It is very upsetting to read. And so it just I don't know. It feels like if you're especially if you're gonna have it be that like this well described and upsetting, it should be more fundamental to the subject of the book. But that's all I'm gonna say. And, if you haven't read it, you don't know what I'm talking about. And that's who cares. I don't think Karen Kingsbury had bad intentions with any of the things she said, but if someone reads this book who doesn't have as much knowledge about autism or doesn't think about the story as critically, this book could potentially give some problematic ideas or phrasing. There's a reader's letter at the end of the book that does a good job of addressing some of these issues, but it does spoil a major plot point, so I understand why it was put at the end. I think that's definitely important to read. Karen Kingsbury explains that the story for this book is based on a very similar series of events that she witnessed herself. That gives this book a lot of credit. Overall, I don't think the depictions of Holden's autism and his improvements are unrealistic. However, as Karen herself acknowledges, it is important to note that what happens in the story absolutely is a miracle. Many people with autism who have high support needs, low functioning is an outdated term, don't improve in social skills to the degree that Holden does, and especially not in such a relatively short period of time. That being said, it is still possible. That's the first important thing to keep in mind going into this book. Secondly, Karen struggles with her wording in this book. I think a lot of it is unintentional because she also struggles with wording in some areas that aren't related to autism. She writes about how Holden wasn't born this way, which seems to imply that he wasn't born with autism. However, she also uses the term regression often, which aligns more with actual views of autism. This leads me to believe that she means Holden wasn't born expressing those traits of autism rather than that he wasn't born with autism at all. She also uses certain outdated terms like high functioning, but that's understandable given when this was written. Finally, there are certain problematic views, and at times I struggle to tell if they're meant to be of the character's uneducated views of autism or if Karen actually agrees. There are multiple mentions of the possibility of vaccines causing autism. This is a very complicated subject that I'm not going to get very deep into here, but vaccines do not cause autism. To give Karen credit, she does acknowledge that there's no undeniable proof that vaccines are correlated with autism, and it seems like it's more connected to the character's lack of education on the subject, but it's something to be aware of. A lot of characters use terms like normal to refer to people who don't have autism, but that definitely seems like more of a character trait than an actual idea Karen's trying to present to her readers. With all of that out of the way, this was actually a beautiful story. I absolutely do recommend reading it while keeping my previous points in mind. There were a lot of things that I've learned over my years working with children with autism that I think were portrayed very well. I like how Karen tackled the subject of how it's still important to communicate and be there for someone with autism, even if they don't seem to respond to you. People with mental disabilities like this understand a lot more than people give them credit for. I love the way that Karen implements faith into the story. The point of this story is that Holden is not the only one in a prison, although that wording does make me feel a little weird in relation to autism. Everyone is in a prison of their own, and God gives us freedom from that. This book captures that very well, and there are so many beautiful moments in all the relationships formed and strengthened in this story. It can teach you a lot about the importance of being kind and understanding. Holden and Ella have such a sweet relationship, and from my own experience, I can attest that there really can be one specific person that makes a connection and brings out progress in someone with autism more than anyone else does. I particularly appreciate how the story focuses on friendship much more than it focuses on romance. I don't want to say too much more about the plot, but I definitely recommend reading it. You can always find a way to get offended by the things other people say or the specific wording they use, but I think it's far more important to look past the smaller details at the overarching themes and messages. I believe Karen Kingsbury truly cares about supporting people with mental disabilities, and this was, for the most part, a sweet and thoughtful attempt to portray it. The next 4 out of 5 star book is Captain Nobody by Dean Pitchford. This one's really short, so I'm just gonna do it. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. I read it in elementary school, and I just read it again now. This is a nice book about a young boy dealing with the grief of having a brother in a coma, and through that, he gets thrown into circumstances that turn him into a hero. The ending is so sweet and heartwarming. It's a good book with good morals that's probably best fit for children in the later years of elementary school or the earlier years of middle school, but it can be enjoyed by anyone. There are only a couple of things in the content that I want to warn about before you decide if your kid should read this. First of all, it's not a major part of the plot, but there is slight references to suicide. There's a character that everyone thinks is suicidal, but they actually aren't. And second of all, one of the main character's heroic acts involves running out into the highway, and I feel like they didn't do the best job of properly expressing how insanely dangerous that is. But this is a good book, and I would recommend it. I like writing reviews anytime I read a book, and so even though I didn't really have much to say, figured I would. This next one, though, is one that I gave 4 out of 5 stars, but I don't know. I might reread it at some point, and if I do, I might give it 5 stars because this book has really stuck with me, and I think about it all the time. And I love this book, and it's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. It's just so bleak but real, and I feel like it does a really good job of shining light on how hard it can be sometimes for people with autism when they're not in a good environment, a good supportive environment. So, I started this one with a quote, which is I think prime numbers are like life. They're very logical, but you can never work out the rules, even if you spent all your time thinking about them. This book really has the same takeaway as the last one I reviewed, My Friends, which is in the Goodreads Choice Award episode. People are complaining. Oh, that's not what it says. People are complicated, but this time it's about the complications surrounding autism. The way this book is written contributes a lot to its overall effect. Part of the plot is that the book itself was written by the main character, Christopher, and as a result were put directly into his mind. Because of his autism, the book has almost no emotion directly written into it. It explains the events that happen in a very straightforward way. This leaves it up to the reader to come to their own conclusions about how to feel about what happens, which could lead many people to have different experiences with the book. In that way, I think this would be a very interesting book to discuss with other people. The title of the book would lead you to believe that it's about the murder of the dog. However, this is a murder mystery that isn't actually about the murder. In fact, the murderer gets revealed halfway through the book, and not that much is really done to figure it out beforehand. Instead, this book is about the experiences of Christopher and what we learn about his life as he tries to solve the murder and afterwards. Firstly, we learn a lot about Christopher's life through the way that his neighbors and strangers interact with him. There's a severe lack of understanding from most people, but worse than that is the lack of even attempting to understand. Most characters just speak harshly, yell, and call Christopher names. They don't know why Christopher acts the way he does, and they don't want to know. They just want to get angry because something isn't the way they think it should be. Christopher is a complicated person, but he'd seem a lot less complicated if people actually tried to understand him. You would be hard pressed to find a book about a character with autism who has perfect parents. Parents are very rarely prepared to have a child with autism. That's not the child's fault, but it's not necessarily the parents either. However, what's essential and has the most variation is the path the parents choose to take. Do they seek help and attempt to grow in their understanding of their child's needs, or do they get upset by their child's differences and take it out on them? Often it ends up being a mix of both. No parent is perfect, and being unprepared for your child's needs can lead to a myriad of problems. We see this with both of Christopher's parents. Christopher's mom has a short temper, often speaks harshly to him, and even gets physical at times. Christopher's father seems to be more understanding and level headed at times, but absolutely still struggles with moments of aggression and physically harms Christopher at one point. It also seems like he may have become more generally aggressive after losing Christopher's mother. This family dynamic is the real reason to read this book. Even as I'm writing this, I really don't know how to feel about either parent. At the end of the day, they both seem to love him, but they also both have a long way to go. This book isn't written by someone with autism, so you should take the story with a grain of salt, but the author does have experience working with people with autism. From my own knowledge and experience, this seems to be a good depiction of what it's like for some people with autism. It can help give you an increased understanding of the familial struggles that many, many children with special needs go through. My next 4 star review is the book that I just finished reading a few days ago before 13 Reasons Why, which is The Dead Zone by Stephen King. This book is no it, but it was still quite enjoyable. Stephen King is very skilled at creating and developing stories. While this book was 400 pages long, it still felt like there was more he could do with it. After reading it, I know that he's capable of more, but it was a good book. One thing I particularly enjoy with King's writing is his ability to capture those moments where nothing seems to be wrong, but there's still an underlying feeling of unease. That's a challenging thing to do in writing. This book has a great example of that with Johnny and the Wheel of Fortune. I think that might be my favorite scene in the book, either that or the end of part two. One slight complaint I could make is that the identity of the Castle Rock Strangler didn't feel particularly shocking or exciting. While I thought that portion of the story had some great moments, I think it could have been set up better. However, that portion does a great job of showing the mental toll that Johnny's ability takes. Finally, I loved the ending. I won't spoil it, but I thought it ended exactly how it needed to. I appreciated how the ending was somewhat surprising, and I was unsure of exactly where things were going, but it also felt inevitable that things would end up the way they did. Everything was wrapped up very effectively. I enjoyed this book. As with it, Stephen King really takes his time to set up his stories, but once things get moving, they're quite engaging. There are other books by King that are likely more worth reading than this one, but I would still recommend this to people who like Stephen King. I'm going to stop to take a drink of water. We're getting pretty close to the 5-star books, but there's still quite a few. There's a lot of 4 and 5-star books because I mostly just try and read books that I expect to like. This is one of my favorite reviews. And it is my 4-star review of Metamorphosis by Kafka. I went very in depth on this because I remember I think it was right before I was gonna read this, I told one of my friends, and she told me that I think it was that she had like an English teacher who hated this story, and so because I really liked it, I decided to go very in depth about all the reasons why I liked it, to explain that to my friend, to give an alternative perspective. So here we go. This isn't quite 5 stars, but I only really have good things to say about it. I'm impressed by how much meaning was packed into such a short story. This is one of those stories that some people will just view as a weird, pointless story about a man being turned into a bug, and it's entirely possible that was the original intention, but I'm someone who believes that all stories have meaning to them, even if it's unintentional. Therefore, any specific detail or moral of a story is a completely valid interpretation, even if it's not what the author originally intended. However, I'm going to write the rest of this review with the assumption that my interpretation is what Kafka intended when writing the story. The first thing we need to understand before talking about the specific ideas this story tries to get across is that the main character, Gregor, is clearly a good person. He immediately started working after his family experienced financial difficulties and continued to give them the majority of the money he made ever since. He didn't expect any big gestures of appreciation in return and quickly accepted the state of things when his family stopped acknowledging his sacrifice altogether. Even after his transformation, or I suppose I should say his metamorphosis, he continues to be considerate of his family, including staying hidden in his room so they don't have to see him. The first moral of the story is made clear from the very beginning. Gregor hardly reacts to discovering that he's transformed. Comically, one of the first things he thinks about is trying to go back to sleep. What if I just go back to sleep for a bit and forget all this nonsense? He thought. But with things as they stood, that was impossible. He was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state, there was no way he could adopt that position. The other primary thing he begins to worry about is being late to work. Although Gregor cares about his job, it's made clear that the company he works for doesn't respect his workers. Not only does it appear that the workers are strictly admonished for being late to work, but the company sends a manager to find people when they don't show up for work. Because Gregor is unable to open the door to his room, the manager gets upset and tells Gregor that his job is not safe, despite Gregor previously telling the reader that he has never taken a single day off work. This depiction of Gregor's job comments on the state of the companies that we work for, and possibly even the state of capitalism if you want to take it that far. Gregor is already treated as subhuman by the company he works for, so it doesn't even make a difference to him when he literally isn't a human. I think this story can also be seen as a commentary on how the world changes people and makes them unrecognizable. We're told that Gregor is rarely ever home because he's working. This is also made clear when he appears to be unsure of his family's routines and whether or not they've changed. I think the transformation could partially be a representation of how the family doesn't recognize the person Gregor has become because he's been too busy working. As a result, they're shocked and can't believe that he's the same person. Even Gret, his loyal younger sister, eventually exclaims that, quote, "I won't mention my brother's name in the same breath as this monster," end quote. He spent all that time working to support his family, but his family has grown used to it and only sees the change it's caused in him instead of being appreciated. Getting back to a more literal interpretation of his transformation, this book shows how society treats those who are viewed as other, those who don't align with the typical view of what is normal or acceptable. Everyone reacts negatively to Gregor. His mother doesn't want to look at Gregor and screams whenever she sees him. His father tries to kill Gregor, and the hired staff either quit their job or antagonize Gregor. Even Gret eventually turns on him. She goes from lovingly helping him to apathetically helping him, and finally to deciding with conviction that they must get rid of him. In the same way, this principle applies to anyone else who doesn't fit in with society. The reactions to Gregor's physical appearance are reminiscent of societal standards of beauty and something like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, or whatever. But it's the same for people who don't fit in because of various disabilities such as autism or Down syndrome. This treatment of Gregor also shows us how, sometimes, even a good and caring nature isn't enough to counter our implicit biases. Gret loves Gregor before the transformation, and that love continues after he transforms. She helps him and, at first, seems to be the only person who really understands him. And yet, she's still overpowered by her biases toward those who don't fit in with societal standards. She still freaks out and runs away when she sees Gregor, and eventually her biases completely overcome any altruism she had, and she is happy when Gregor dies. This is a representation of how many people who believe themselves to be accepting turn out not to be when faced with a situation that truly requires their acceptance. Finally, this story shows the way people often assume the needs of others without actually consulting them, especially those with special needs that most people don't understand. Gregor's mother assumes that Gregor can't understand her, even though she's been too afraid of him to attempt to determine if he can. Gregor's sister makes the same assumption. Instead of finding some sort of way for Gregor to answer yes or no questions, which would be quite easily done, Gret assumes that Gregor wants all of the furniture moved out of his room and continues to move it. However, as the reader, we know that Gregor wants the furniture to stay. Just like what happens with Gregor, we often assume too quickly that people we don't understand are equally unable to understand us, and in doing so, we tend to make things worse for them. This is an interesting, unusual, and slightly gross commentary on humanity. It's a quick read that can tell you a lot if you look deeper into it, or just be a fun story if you don't feel like analyzing. I usually tend to enjoy and appreciate stories that seem to comment on understanding or the lack thereof in our society. This didn't affect me as much as some stories have, but it's so short that it's definitely worth reading, in my opinion. Next up, our third to last 4-star review is The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. This was one of the first books I reviewed. I've only been reviewing books for about the past year or so, so anything I read before that isn't on here. Um, So, 4 out of 5 stars, Joy Luck Club. I mostly just gave this four stars because I can't give everything 5 stars. It was a very good book. It just didn't impact me as much as the other ones I've reviewed, but it still had an impact. This book is kind of hard for me to explain. It follows 4 different pairs of Chinese American mothers and daughters who are all part of the Joy Luck Club. Despite this connection, their plot lines are largely unrelated to each other. You should not go into this book expecting everything to come together in the end for one big conclusion. This book is more like a collection of short stories. It doesn't have connecting plot lines, but rather has connecting themes. The biggest themes are heritage and perspective. The mothers care deeply about their heritage and want to instill this care into their children. Unfortunately for them, their children are growing up in America, so they have a completely different culture being forced onto them. This leads to the children wanting to assimilate into American culture as quickly as possible, while often trying to distance themselves from their Chinese heritage. When we read from the children's perspectives, we can see how they view their parents as being stuck in their ways and being too harsh about certain things. They don't fully understand why their heritage is so important to them. But then we read from the parents' perspectives, and we see all of the things that they had to go through while living in China, the trials they experienced, and the lessons they learned, the things that showed them how to give their children better lives than they had. This gives us a strong understanding of both sides and leads us to sympathize with both the parents and their children. It's hard to say that there's a main character because there are 7 different characters that we follow at different times, and each story is largely unique. Also, if I say any names wrong, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to do my best. However, the book begins and ends with Jingmei Wu, and she has the most chapters from her perspective, so she's arguably the closest thing to a main character. What makes this interesting is that she's the only mother daughter pair of the 4 that never gets a chapter from the mother's perspective. Her mother died before the start of the book. Not a spoiler, it's literally the second sentence. So we don't get to hear from her. As a result, this helps us understand the perspective of the other 3 daughters. We see the questions that Jingmei has about her mother and the concerns about how her mother felt about her, and we can more easily connect with them because we aren't given the answers. We don't know how her mom really felt inside, we only know what other people tell Jingmei. However, because of the other 3 families, we understand what these mothers went through, and we know that there's definitely a lot more to it than Jingmei realizes or understands. The stories are all quite interesting, and there are a lot of great quotes and important moments that stand out. Because it follows the perspective of 7 different characters with mostly unrelated stories, it can get kind of confusing at times. I found it very helpful to look back at the table of contents at the beginning of each chapter to remind myself of what had happened so far with each character and their family. Luckily, because the stories don't have much overlap, it's not too important to remember all the specific details of what happened. It's mostly just adding more short stories to contribute to the overall themes of the characters' experiences. This was a nice, touching, and intriguing book about Chinese heritage and the struggles that can arise from a difference of views within a family. I recommend reading this book to truly understand what it's about and what it's like to read. It's easy to get into and get through, and at the very least, I don't think anyone will regret reading this. I'm glad I chose to read it. My second to last 4-star book is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a great book, but is a bit too short to have enough of an impact on me to make it 5 stars. But I think that ends up working in its favor. While I did thoroughly enjoy this book, I get the feeling that it would start to get boring if it went on for too much longer. Of course, it's entirely possible that Fitzgerald could have added some really interesting stuff, but that's just what I predict may have happened. I think he understood the story he had to tell and made the book just the right length to get his point across. This book is kind of like if a Jane Austen novel was written by a man, and from the perspective of a man a century later. I say that in a positive way because I have to find a way to connect everything to Jane Austen. That's kind of funny that I wrote that. Interesting. There are going to be some spoilers in my review, but I'm going to do my best to avoid anything too big or specific. The story of Gatsby is quite relatable. Gatsby was in love with a woman, he realistically has no chance with her, and he's very awkward around her because he can't stop thinking about it. I'm sure that's something that many of us have experienced. But while relatable in some ways, Gatsby is also very mysterious. He kind of reminds me of the Count of Monte Cristo. He's a very wealthy man, but nobody knows how he obtained his riches, and he has an unknown past with a married woman. He's extremely well known and people love to gossip about him. This makes him a very interesting character and creates a strong desire to learn more about him. I believe this book has 3 main themes. Firstly, it addresses the romanticization of marital affairs and stresses the importance of a firm, stable relationship. There are multiple affairs in this book and none of them end well. It's also a book about the importance of friendship. Nick never fully approved of Gatsby, but he still tries to help and honor him. He acts as a friend toward Gatsby even when his other friends choose to prioritize other things. And finally, the story acknowledges the effect that secrets, such as affairs, can have on all relationships, whether it may be romantic relationships, friendships, or even just general acquaintances. We see a wide range of people that are affected and propelled into action as a result of the secrets kept by various characters in the book. Overall, this was a good book that I would recommend reading. It's a fairly short story, and while I was close to getting a bit bored toward the end, it's pretty engaging. And the final 4-star book, before we get to the 5 stars, which I will say there's kind of a lot of 5-star reviews, but it's about the same amount as the 4-star reviews. Our final 4-star review is It by Stephen King. And I do want to say, this book totally would be 5 stars if not for one thing. And if you know the plot of It, you probably already know what it is. And even though it's a small thing, a small portion of the book, I still stand by taking a full star away because of it. But I go very in depth with this review. So you don't need to I don't think I need to, explain anything right now. I'm just gonna read it. This is another one that I'll give a couple of warnings beforehand. This one, more than many other books, is gonna have huge spoilers. Um, it also does discuss sexual content. Again, nothing too explicit, but it does involve children. Um, so, but I think I'm. This is one of my favorite reviews. I think I made my points very well. So here we go. This is not like my usual 4-star rating, even though I put the same description. I would have given this book 5 stars if it wasn't for one specific plot point. I like most of the other books I've given 5 stars more than this one, but it was still a good enough book to earn those 5 stars. However, I was so bothered by this one plot point that it takes away an entire star on its own, despite only being about 5 pages long. Trust me, I'll get to that later, but I want to start with the positives of this book. Overall, this was a great book and quite impressive in its scale. Stephen King is a very detailed writer, and at times that's both a strength and a weakness. Some writers use lots of detail, and some intentionally use very little detail. Neither is problematic on its own, but both can cause issues when they reach an extreme. A story with too little detail can become difficult to get invested in, but a story with too much detail can begin to drag. I would say that Stephen King's attention to detail benefits this book more than it harms it. There are some moments where the book starts to feel kind of slow, but King usually manages to keep the story moving just enough to stay interesting. Other than the one part that I'll talk about soon, I really enjoyed the plot of this story. It was a very interesting character to slowly uncover more information about. The book left you to speculate about things for a long time, but by the end of the book, you have a pretty decent understanding of how it works. Although there's still not an answer to everything, but that's a good thing. I thought the characters were all interesting, and while some contributed more to the story than others, nobody really felt unnecessary. The main friend group was enjoyable to follow, and it was sweet seeing their friendships form. The plot overall was a fun representation of the imagination of children. The actual structure of the book was pretty unique. The way it continually jumped back and forth between 1957 and 58 and 1984 and 85 was actually pretty cool in my opinion, but it would also likely be confusing for some people. It's not for everyone, but I think it did a good job of making the story as a whole progress at the same rate. If it was all done in the order the events happened, this book would essentially be two different stories in one book, but by continually going between the two time periods, the action rose in each at the same time, and it helped the book feel more like one full cohesive story happening over multiple decades. There are some sweet messages you can pull from this book, primarily about the power and importance of friendship. However, I also think Stephen King agrees with Bill Denbrough in the story when he says, "I mean, can't you guys just let a story be a story?" Stephen King seems to be more interested in writing stories than in capturing world experiences and the complexities of humanity, but that's not a bad thing. Stories are valuable as a way to pass time and keep our imagination active, perhaps even as active as the kids in this story. However, this does lead to my primary issue with this book. If you've read this book before or know the plot, you know exactly what I'm about to discuss. At the end of the plotline taking place in 1958, about 1,100 pages into the book, the Losers Club, the main friend group, has severely wounded it. It is not dead, but it has run away to go back into hiding and heal for many years. What we see in both 1958 and 1985 is that once it is severely wounded or killed, maybe even just once it goes back into hibernation, the people start to forget about what happened. By the time the members of the Losers Club are adults, they've completely forgotten about what happened in 1958, and at the very end of the book, they forget again. Now, this is where we reach the problem. The 11-year-olds get lost in the sewer system in 1958 after severely harming it. Eddie was able to lead them on the way to it because of their bond, essentially. But now that they've begun forgetting, the bond of their friendship is weakening and Eddie can't figure out where to go. They decide they need to do something to strengthen their bond in order to get out. So, Beverly, the one girl of the group, decides that they should all have sex with her. Stephen King then goes on to write an entire 5 pages in which a group of 11-year-old children have sex. I've never been so flabbergasted by a book. I got 1,100 pages into a very good book just to be hit with this. I think this is stupid, disgusting, and unnecessary for multiple reasons. It's kind of crazy to even conceive of this plot point, but to actually put it in the book is absurd to me. Nobody wants to read about young children having sex, and the people that do are not who we should be writing for. In my mind, this kind of descriptive writing of children having sex is not that far off from actual child pornography. There are worse and more descriptive ways that this could have been written, and it does have an actual plot related reason for being in the story, but my argument is that it still shouldn't be in the story. The difference between this and something like Lolita by Nabokov, which also has a plotline about a child having sex, is highlighted by Stephen King's own writing that I highlighted earlier. Lolita is a story written with the intention of providing social commentary and bringing the horrors of pedophilia to the reader's attention. It's not about the story itself as much as it's about what the story tells you about humanity and the world. Stephen King, on the other hand, just wants to let a story be a story. There's no social commentary that comes from this scene. He just utilizes the children having sex as a shocking plot point to continue on the story. This feels both disgusting and unnecessary. I do want to say here, just interject because I don't know that I said it too much. I made it too clear in this review that, like, it's not super explicit. Like, Stephen King has put other sex scenes in books, and it's not like that. Like, it's not really about the sex itself, and it's not too detailed, but it's still just insane to put a plot point in there, and it's still 5 pages long. It makes it even worse because there are so many other ways Stephen King could have strengthened their bond without writing about children having sex. There's only one scene left in 1958 after this point. It's a scene where they all cut their palms with a shard of glass, hold hands so their blood mixes together, and promise to come back if it ever returns. This is powerful and a great plot point. It's also something that would definitely strengthen their bond, so why not just have this moment happen while they're lost in the sewers, and then after they do it, they find their way out? Or maybe even they just look up and see that one of the pipes suddenly goes straight out of the sewers. Because there's plenty of like magical stuff like that happens in this story. They could even come out right in the Barrens and end that scene in the same way. It would make that moment and their promise even more impactful, and it would completely remove the sex scene from the book. I'm taking 1 star away because of this scene. On the one hand, it feels a little extreme to remove an entire star for one scene, but I think some people would react even more strongly than that, and it would still be valid. As I previously stated, I think this is an upsetting and unneeded part of the plot, but my bigger issue is what it tells me about Stephen King as an author. The fact that he thought it was fine to put this in a story. Writing about something like this takes a lot of thought and care, as shown by a book like Lolita, and King clearly didn't put enough thought or care into how to put something like this in his book. If he had put thought and care into it, he would have realized that he probably shouldn't have written it at all. While I'm complaining about things, I do have a few smaller issues that stood out to me. For the portion of the plot in 1985, I thought Tom, Audra, and Henry showing up at Derry was really interesting, and I was excited to see where things went. Henry does do a little bit, but the other two are pretty pointless. Audra really doesn't do anything at all, although I do like Bill taking care of her at the end of the story, and Tom literally just brings Audra to it, which we don't even see, might I add, and then dies. Tom coming back and Bev having to confront him again could have been really cool, but Tom feels wasted as a character. Audra and Henry are a little more interesting, but I also wish more had been done with them. And to be clear, when I say Tom feels wasted as a character, I mean he feels wasted in this end part where he comes back to Derry. I still stand by what I said earlier that none of the characters feel like pointless or unnecessary. Like Tom is still a very valuable addition to the book. He's just underutilized in the final section. And finally, the way Stephen King writes women just feels a little odd. It could be much worse. He at least doesn't make them seem entirely defenseless or less important than the men, but it seems unnecessarily sexual. Considering how often he mentions the breasts of every female character, it only seems fair for him to have a lot more mentions of the balls of male characters or something. My point is just, it's kind of weird to specifically talk about the women's breasts all the time. It's like every single woman has some mention of how they cross their arms across their small breasts or their large breasts or whatever. I just don't understand why it's mentioned so much. There are some other things as well in addition to this, but I can't recall them right now. I also want to interject again here that, like, in the Dead Zone, there were also a couple weird, like, unnecessary mentions of, like, similar things. and like sexual things and whatnot. I think it's kind of, but with men too. I think it's kind of just part of Stephen King's writing style, and it's not like horrible. It's just these little like one-off sentences that I can easily look past. Um, but I don't know. It's a little weird. It's not for me, but overall, I still really enjoy Stephen King's writing and storytelling. Anyway, finishing this up. Although most of this review was me complaining, this was mostly a very good book. It has its flaws, but it's still a good read. I don't personally know a lot of people who like horror, but I would probably recommend this to anyone who does. It's an iconic story that I'm sure will probably be remembered as a horror classic in the future. Just be aware of what you're getting yourself in for, I suppose. And now we have made it to the 5-star reviews. The first three that are shown on here are Fake Skating, My Friends, and Sunrise on the Reaping, which are all in the Goodreads Choice Award video. So go watch that. That is the last plug because that's all the books from that video. Now, the first 5 out of 5-star review is The Body by Stephen King. This is also the last Stephen King book I have on in my reviews so far. Um, the umbrella for 5 out of 5 stars is this is a great book that doesn't need any major changes. I will look back on this book fondly and be likely to bring it up in future literary discussions. I also totally forgot. I actually finished The Dead Zone, and then the next day I read The Body, and then the next day I read 13 Reasons Why. So I actually read The Body more recently than The Dead Zone, but it's all close together. Anyway, here we go. Gosh, I love this book. This is one of those books that gives me the desire to reread it the moment I finish it. The other two Stephen King books, I feel like I emphasized that weird. The other two Stephen King books I've read have some supernatural elements to them, so it's cool to see how interesting of a story Stephen King is capable of writing without that. I don't know what it was like to be a child in the 60s, but this book seems very accurate. There are so many incredible scenes. The train, the leeches, Gordy's talk with Chris, they're all so memorable and well written. It's believably something that a child could experience, and it's filled with the emotions and fear that a child would feel in these situations. Just like with It, King is incredibly talented at writing the dynamic of a childhood friend group. It's clear that King understands his characters very well and isn't afraid to have characters say strange things and act in strange ways before we understand why. Each character truly feels like their own person. The format of this book is really interesting and works well. It primarily focuses on the narrative of the friend's journey to find the body, but occasionally interjects with a story written by Gordy or narration from Gordy in the future. It's an effective way of teaching the reader more about Gordy and the direction of his life, and King does a great job of emulating the writing of an amateur author. This book is quite short, but I think it's the perfect length. It drops you into the life of a believable, pre established friend group as they go on one particular adventure, and then that's it. Everything that happens feels like an important contribution to the story. By keeping the story short, it leaves room for the reader to connect their own experiences to the characters in this story and imagine what their life must have been like outside of these events. Stand By Me is an amazing movie, which makes sense considering how great the source material is. I highly recommend reading this book, even if you don't typically like Stephen King, and then you should watch the movie. It's one of my favorite movies. Next up for 5 stars is Northanger North Northanger Abbey, Northanger. I think it's Northanger because it's like hanger. I looked it up at one point. I don't even. It doesn't matter now. Here we go. 5 out of 5 stars. Northanger Abbey. Jane Austen. This was a great book. I love Jane Austen so much. This book is fairly different from her other books, and I imagine that's largely because it's her first full length novel. It's more direct with its social commentary and has a lot of fourth wall breaking where she addresses the reader. I think that makes for a very interesting read and could cause the book to be more interesting both to people who have read her other books and liked them and people who didn't like her other books. The main character, Catherine, is probably most similar to Marianne Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility. Because Jane Austen was younger when writing this, she wrote a story about a young, naive girl, which I think was an effective choice. Catherine's traits aren't quite as severe as Marianne's, but the connections are definitely there. The story is largely focused on the naivety of Catherine. This leads to most of the plot points being fairly predictable, but not to Catherine. Rather than the intrigue coming from trying to predict many of the major plot points, it comes from wondering how Catherine is going to be affected when she learns the truth, and how much her limited knowledge and vivid imagination is affecting our view of the situations. Also, I don't know if you can hear my dog, but if you can, I'm sorry. Mr. Tilney is, unsurprisingly, a great love interest. He feels very unique from all the other love interests in Jane Austen's books, but if I had to choose, I'd say he's possibly most similar to Mr. Knightley, at least in some ways. The marriage proposal at the end of the book is the most underwhelming of the Jane Austen books I've read, but the explanation of the events that led up to the proposal and the incident before it is incredibly satisfying and humorous. Overall, this is another great addition to Jane Austen's list of novels. I haven't been disappointed once by her books, and I've only got one left to go, Mansfield Park, which did kind of disappoint me. I think this book has the potential to appeal to both Jane Austen fans and people who generally don't like her novels, although it's still a romance novel. It exceeded my expectations, and I would definitely recommend. This is definitely one that sort of straddled the line between 4 and 5 stars, but it fell more in the 5 star territory for me. So it's like a low 5 star, but I still really like it, and I just love Jane Austen. Next up is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which is honestly, I mean, I don't know what I said in my review, but this is a book that has grown on me a lot since reading it. Like, I feel like my opinion, I really liked it when I read it, but my opinion of it is like so high now. I love this book. So here we go. The quote I started with is: mere existence had always been too little for him. He had always wanted more. This book definitely took a bit to get into, but once I began to get invested in the story, I didn't stop. This is primarily due to the characters and the way they're written. Frankly, the events of this book are not particularly exciting. Even the titular crime itself isn't as action packed as in other novels. What makes the novel truly interesting is learning about the characters and waiting to see how they react to various events, conversations, and revelations. Dostoevsky is incredible at writing characters. We know enough about each character to care about them and get attached, but each character still has enough mystery remaining that we can't fully predict what they're going to say or how they're going to react to things. You obviously see this with Raskolnikov's complete and bipolar complex and bipolar mental state, but the same thing happens with the other characters as well. Also, this is another one where I'm probably going to say names wrong. Is Pulcheria going to understand what she's told or be distressed by it? Is Dunya going to support Raskolnikov or leave him alone like he asks? And what the heck is going on with Svidrigailov? And am I saying any of those names right? And don't even get me started on Sonia. I truly think that she is just as fascinating of a character as Raskolnikov. Her own actions and the way they affect her view of others feels both extremely powerful and thought-provoking. Despite being looked down on by society because of her method of making money, she's potentially the most morally good person in the story. Her relationship with Raskolnikov is incredibly engrossing throughout the entire novel. Her character makes up for the 20 pages of what feels like unnecessary exposition that we get from her father in the beginning of the novel. I was surprised by the ending, and this is where there will be some spoilers. Both surprised by the events and surprised that it surprised me. I assumed I knew where the story was going, but it managed to get there in a way that touched on a lot of concepts I didn't quite expect. The unwavering loyalty of certain characters in the novel makes for a beautifully powerful ending. Through these people, Raskolnikov manages to go from feeling hopeless and unnecessarily restrained by society to discovering a true appreciation for his life and a reason to keep living. He may never have fully agreed that what he did was wrong, but these people love him so much that he knows he'll be able to move past it. And that leads me to the final thing I want to touch on. I think the idea of a person who is so intelligent that they convince themselves that they have a right to kill someone, both for the sake of the world and the benefit of themselves, is a very intriguing concept, especially when it's partially based on the logic that previous famous rulers have done the same thing. It makes for an interesting situation where at times Raskolnikov is more upset by people thinking the murder was wrong than he is upset by the guilt he feels for committing the murder. This is a great story, and I'd likely be willing to read it again in the future. It's an interesting insight into the troubled mind of a murderer. The story doesn't focus too much on God and faith, but the moments where it does are quite thought provoking. If you're looking for an eventful and graphic story of a man murdering people, then this is not the book for you. But if you're intrigued by the complexities of guilt and intelligence and are ready to dive deep into the psyches of each character, I'd recommend this book. And then I ended with this quote where a character says, "Then you still have faith in life? Thank God, thank God." And he responds, "I haven't faith, but I've just been weeping in my mother's arms. I haven't faith, but I've just asked her to pray for me. I don't know what it is, Dunya. I don't understand it." Next up is my 5 star review of Emma by Jane Austen. I love this book so much. This is my favorite by Jane Austen, although I think Persuasion is her best. I'd recommend reading Pride and Prejudice first, but I recommend reading this one second. Emma is the most entertaining of all of Jane Austen's books. There are a great number of lovable and loathable characters, as well as a variety of interesting events. Emma herself is a very fun main character. She is good natured enough to be likable, but she often lets her fantasies get the best of her, which leads to a variety of humorous or upsetting misunderstandings. She's a fun character to read about and is involved in a lot of interesting situations. Mr. Knightley is the greatest man in fiction. I've said this many times and I stand by it. He is such a great guy without seeming artificially perfect. He has his own flaws, but they only make him more interesting and engrossing. He thinks very highly of Emma, and because of this, he isn't afraid to call her out when he's disappointed by her selfish actions. It takes a serious kind of love to be able to do that. Most of all, I love how he's thoughtful toward everyone, not just Emma. Harriet is a really good addition to the story. It's interesting to see what it's like for someone from a lower class of society to try and fit in with the upper class. Her friendship with Emma has a lot of sweet moments, and it's intriguing to see where they're at by the end of the book. There are so many great moments in this book, but I won't be very specific about it because I want you to experience them yourself. Anytime Miss Bates is around is usually pretty amusing. There's a very powerful moment with Miss Bates at the picnic, and the moment with Harriet at the ball is possibly one of my favorite moments in any novel. I've loved this book for a while, and while I think it will remain in my top 5 favorite novels for a long time. Oh, the word while wasn't supposed to be there. I've loved this book for a while, and I think it will remain in my top 5 favorite novels for a long time. It's a great example of everything I enjoy from Jane Austen novels. Realistic and often humorous and or wholesome characters, a great love interest, an intriguing main character, and just enough action to keep you entertained without moving too quickly and taking away from the feel of their everyday life. This is a great book to read whether you've read Jane Austen before or not. Now, the next one is actually my current favorite book of all time, and also probably my shortest book review. There's one other that might be shorter, because this is just a book that's so amazing that I feel like you just have to experience it yourself. There's no amount of explaining that will help you understand. So I'm just going to read this book is so incredible that I don't know what to say, so I'm going to limit myself to one paragraph. This is my new favorite book. Oh, sorry. This is Brave New World, by the way, by Huxley. It's an incredibly engaging read and a perfect length. It has a lot of fascinating ideas about how society could be changed by the advancement of technology and consumerism. It's aged beautifully. It goes without saying that this book was far ahead of its time. It paints a gorgeously philosophical view of the wonders of human suffering. Huxley is an incredibly intelligent writer. This book has some of the most complex characters I have ever read about, and that is potentially the most important thing to me in a novel. Just read the book, it deserves more appreciation. And honestly, that's all I'm gonna say on it. It's so good. Just do it. Read Brave New World, please. Um, we're getting close ish. Next up, 5-star review of And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I'm also realizing I keep saying like we're getting closer. You guys can just check how long is left in the episode. I don't know why I'm saying this. Okay, And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. I can see why this is the best selling mystery book of all time, and I can definitely see how it influenced Clue. Going into this book, everyone kept saying, good luck figuring out who the murderer is. But just to be clear, I'm not going to spoil who the murderer is. So don't worry. I assumed I could figure out who it was because I know enough murder mystery tropes and general plot twist tropes. I was convinced I was right all the way up until the end, and then it was literally the last person I would have suspected. A lot of books try to make their plot twists as shocking and unpredictable as possible, and as a result of this, plot twists start to become more predictable over time. You just have to figure out what would be the most shocking and unexpected thing that could happen, and then you start to expect it. This book is different. I was so confident in my guess because I thought it would be the craziest reveal out of any of the characters. But in this book, as with many good murder mysteries, it could be literally any of them. Something that I had to adjust to with murder mysteries compared to other genres is that murder mysteries aren't necessarily about figuring out the most shocking plot twists or slowly unraveling the mystery. Sometimes a murder mystery just has a bunch of crazy stuff happen with a few very hidden clues thrown in, and then at the end there's an explanation given that makes everything finally make sense. And I like that. It's a reminder that we never truly know what's going on inside someone's head just by the way they act externally. It might not work as well for other genres, but I think it's effective in a murder mystery. The murders truly felt impossible at times. Part of what made things so compelling was the seeming lack of opportunity. How does this killer keep killing people without being caught? The killer is very cunning, which makes every situation more engaging, and yet, in the end, it all makes sense. I love that moment where every piece finally clicks into place, and this book does that very well. The collection of characters are very interesting and have a great dynamic. Their different personalities work well with each other to create both drama and alliances. Their actions and reactions to the situation all feel very believable and realistic. At first, I was worried that it would be hard to keep track of each individual character, but the book is written in a way where you don't necessarily have to remember a lot of the specific details about each person to understand the overall gravity of the situation. And obviously, it became a lot easier to remember who each character was once there were less of them left. This is an enjoyable and quick read. I think I read it all in a day. If you like murder mysteries, you should definitely read this book, especially because it's so famous. If you have the time, you could get through this whole thing in one day or even one sitting. And if you don't know if you like murder mysteries, this would probably be a good one to start with. Next up is a 5-star review of The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. This is one of my other favorite books. I can't believe my dog is still barking. I feel like it's been like half an hour at this point. This review will have a few mild spoilers, but I don't think that really matters for this book. This is a book where it's difficult to explain the plot. It's essentially just a depressed teenager going about life losing his mind. He's all over the place, and many of his thoughts and actions contradict each other. You often don't know what he actually thinks because he doesn't know either. And that's why I love this book. It's not trying to draw you in with some action packed plotline, it's simply demonstrating what life is like when experiencing something like this. This book had to have come from a very personal place. It's in my top 3 books I've read. I first read it as a junior in high school. At the time, I thought it was a good book, but very over the top. I then became very depressed the following year, and upon rereading this book, my view has completely changed. While, yes, this is a bit of an extreme example, I never struggled with alcoholism or some of the other things. Overall, this is an extremely accurate depiction of what it's like to be a depressed teenage boy. Reading this book was a very therapeutic experience because of how much I was able to relate to Holden Caulfield. I appreciate how little we truly know about Holden's life and his past. He slowly reveals information throughout the book, but even then, he's an unreliable narrator, so we don't know how much of his interpretation of events to believe. One thing that's made very clear, however, is that he's had a difficult and traumatic childhood and likely never had the support system he needed. Everything about Holden feels so real and relatable. The way he thinks about himself, the negative thoughts that clearly don't align with his actual views of people. Most of all, I was amazed by how accurate the depiction of Holden's suicidal thoughts felt. It's the same way it was for me. It wasn't a specific plan of when and how to do it, it was simply the sudden, unexpected thought of, I kind of wish I was dead. It felt incredibly saddening and real. Holden's relationships with others are very interesting. Although he can often be aggressive and off putting, you come to realize that he actually likes most of the people he knows. It seems like he may be trying to push them away because of his depression rather than his actual feelings toward those people. Again, very relatable. His relationship with his younger sister Phoebe is particularly powerful. As someone with a younger sister, any scene that she was in made me especially emotional. It really shows you how depression doesn't just harm the depressed person, but everyone around them, especially those who look up to that person like a younger sibling. J.D. Salinger captures the experience of being a depressed teenager in a way that I didn't think was possible. Even if you can't relate to this book, it still provides an incredibly powerful and profound image. I highly recommend reading this to understand the struggles that some people go through or to see that you're not alone. The next book, which is a bit of a different direction, is my 5-star review of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which I didn't read until about a year ago, and oh my goodness, I love it so much. So here's my review. Man, it's like these books were written specifically for me. I read these books to a student I work with, which, just to be clear for those who don't know, Alice's Adventures of Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are like two like short books, I guess maybe novellas that Lewis Carroll wrote, and then this book just like combined them together into one because they're similar, and I think Alice is the main character of both. So when I say these books, it's still just this one review, but I'm referring to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass as two separate books. Um, I read these books to a student I work with, so that helps me look at them both from the perspective of books for kids and books for adults. In both senses, they are amazing. Lewis Carroll is incredibly talented with wordplay, and that's the biggest appeal of these books. They are so clever in the way they make the most nonsensical conversations become logical. Every verbal misunderstanding is so well thought out and provides a level of humor while simultaneously helping to uniquely characterize each character. And there are a lot of characters. These books genuinely made me laugh out loud many times, although that's partially because I was reading out loud. I do think that the first book is possibly a bit more interesting as far as the plot goes, but overall they're about equally as clever. For this reason, I think these books are great for adults despite being viewed more as books for children. There are a variety of silly moments and clever wordplay that probably won't be truly appreciated until the reader's an adult. But how do they work as books for kids? Well, I do think I should start by saying that this shouldn't be the only thing your kids read. Overall, the stories don't really have morals to them. The stories are essentially just a bunch of strange and often rude characters having confusing interactions with a generally polite but occasionally argumentative little girl. I'm sure you could find ways to add morals to certain situations, like the importance of being polite to people when they're rude to you, but they aren't explicitly made clear. But I don't think that takes away from the books. Not every story has to be focused on a moral. These are very fun stories, and even if children may not be able to fully comprehend all the jokes, I do think most kids will enjoy the strange conversations and amusing events of the stories. The student that I read this to really enjoyed the stories and comprehended a lot of what I read. If you pair these with other books that have more clear morals, I think this could make a great foundation for literature your child consumes. I personally enjoyed the books a lot, and I think this is a good recommendation to anyone looking for whimsical and quirky stories that skillfully capture the imagination and wonder of childhood. This next one is a bit of a different book. It's this is also a very short review. It's a book I gave 5 out of 5 stars called Celebration of Discipline: The Path to Spiritual Growth by Richard J. Foster. We read it in one of my college classes, and it's just talking about the different spiritual disciplines of Christianity. So here's my quick little review. Despite being written almost 50 years ago at this point, this book has only become more relevant. It provides a critical and in-depth look at the spiritual disciplines that that comprise or should comprise a Christian life. This made me rethink many areas of my life and will have a positive impact on the expression of my faith for the rest of my life. I highly recommend reading this book, but I also think it's important to take your time with it. Linger on each chapter, find ways to implement each discipline more actively in your life, and find people to discuss the book with if possible. So there's that. Next up, another one that's a big shift from the last one is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, which I gave 5 out of 5 stars. This review is more talking about. I don't know. I don't even talk about the book itself or like the plot that much. Someday I want to write a big paper on Lolita because this book has really stuck with me. But here's what I wrote for my review. I'm still happy with it. A lot of reviews for this book have a surprising amount of sympathy for Humbert Humbert, who's the main character and a pedophile. Some people say that it was irresponsible for this book to be written because of that. I think that sympathy is exactly why this book needed to be written. What happened in the book is obviously terrible. There is no excuse, but despite that, the narrator's own validations and excuses for his actions sorry, have not only convinced himself to view them differently, but many of the readers. By putting the reader in the mind of a pedophile, Nabokov has shown the world how powerful and dangerous the self validating mind of a pedophile is. Not everyone should read this book. It's a lot to handle. I'm not even sure I should have read this book. But Nabokov, however he may have come about this knowledge, has painted a clear picture for all of us to see how these problems begin and continue to perpetuate themselves in our society. The fact that there is so much controversy around this book is exactly why it's so important. There shouldn't be controversy. Regardless of Humbert's feelings or what he's convinced himself and the reader that he feels, he is a disgusting person. He should not have these thoughts for children, and his sexual abuse of a child is inexcusable. It doesn't matter if she quote unquote wanted it or not, she is not mature enough to consent or understand these things. She's a young child whose view of love is simply the result of the media she's consumed and the people around her. She was a rebellious child who saw inappropriate acts as a way to be tough and rebel against her unloving mother. She thinks she's in love with him, quote, but we are lovers, aren't we, unquote, but she has no way of truly understanding what that means or the extent to which things can go. She doesn't want to have sex with Humbert, quote, a queer dullness had replaced her usual cheerfulness, unquote, because she's not capable of wanting to. She is incapable of understanding, quote, while eager to impress me with the world of tough kids, she was not quite prepared for certain discrepancies between a kid's life and mine. Pride alone prevented her from giving up, unquote. Which, by the way, is one of the most upsetting things I've read in my life. I can't believe, and like not even necessarily in a bad way. Like I think my whole point is that this book makes people think, and in that way it's good. And just like wow, it's incredibly disturbing. I've never felt the way that Lolita made me feel reading it. I've never felt that way reading a book. Like I was so uncomfortable the whole time. The closest thing was like I was really like powerfully sad when I read My Friends by Frederick Backman. But like I the constant discomfort of Lolita was unlike anything else. And I think it's incredible and powerful and horrifying. That's a review. And yet there is controversy. People argue about Humbert's feelings, his intentions. He doesn't have feelings or intentions, he has an obsession. He can't stop thinking about Lolita. He feels possessive of her, but like he owns her. Quote, she is mine, unquote. He doesn't want to love her, he wants to control her. He doesn't want Lolita, he wants her young body. And he only wants that until she gets too old and he expects to lose interest. There shouldn't be any argument over this, but there is. People argue about biology and human nature instead of acknowledging that he shouldn't be doing any of these things. Nabokov has shown us how some people are willing to accept just about anything when the argument being made is strong enough, and I can't deny it's pretty strong. Humbert does a very effective job of convincing both himself and the reader of his noble intentions, or when his intentions aren't noble, he at least deserves it. The point of the book is to try to make you side with, or at least give a bit of credit to a disgusting pedophile. The point of the book is how you have to constantly remind yourself that Lolita is a child and the things he's telling you are wrong. He's trying to convince you that he's right, and if you don't stand firm in your morals, he'll drag you into his world. This book is complicated. I understand the people that think it shouldn't have been written. I understand how some people have come to sympathize with Humbert. And honestly, I don't fully know where I stand on the book's existence, but it gives you a lot to think about. And it's an experience that you'll never forget and will struggle to move on from. It made me feel more uncomfortable than any book ever has. At best, it will convince you of the horrors of pedophilia and give you a strong desire to take a stand. At worst, yeah, that's right. At worst, it will convince you that some pedophiles have good hearts. Should you read this? It depends on if you think you'll be influenced. And if you think you won't be, then you should read this and see how hard it tries to and how hard you have to fight it. Pedophilia is disgusting and is a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, on to that, straight into another long one. Um, that this is a book I read as a kid and I've loved for a long time, and I just love even more. Um, 5 out of 5 for Rules by Cynthia Lord. I first read this book as a child and enjoyed it, but now that I'm an adult and have worked with children with special needs for multiple years, I appreciate it even more. This is a truly beautiful book that addresses some very important topics surrounding people with special needs and the fears neurotypical people experience when interacting with them. Despite generally being aimed more toward a younger audience, this book made me tear up a few times and make some powerful points that I think are important for all people to read about. What makes this book so great is how effectively and realistically each character is written. Everyone important in the book contributes to the overall themes in a different way. They all have very different yet connected struggles that show the various ways people deal with the same topic. There are definitely going to be spoilers in this because I want to talk about each character. First, the main character's brother, David. David is Catherine's younger brother. I'm not sure if they ever actually said his age, but I think he's around 8 years old, and he has autism. This is the main area where I was worried the book might fail. Mental disabilities like autism are very difficult to properly portray in media without being offensive, especially when it doesn't come from personal experience. From what I could find, Cynthia Lord does not have autism, but she has a son who does. Because of this, she makes the smart decision to have the story be told from the perspective of someone who is neurotypical, while having that character interact with people with mental disabilities. I do not have autism, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I believe that David is a good representation of a person with autism. He is a believable character with many of the traits that I have seen in other children with autism, but those traits are not utilized in a way that makes him seem dangerous, stupid, or helpless. Catherine is a great depiction of an older sister to a child with autism. She's flawed in a way that feels very believable without making her dislikable. She's at times embarrassed of her brother and her friendship with Jason, but it's clear that she truly cares about both of them. She's not embarrassed to know them, but she doesn't have a lot of friends, and she's worried about losing her friends if they judge her for having a brother with autism and a friend who's non-speaking and in a wheelchair. It's selfish, but not abhorrent. She's exasperated at times by the needs of her brother and how much more attention he gets from her parents, but she still takes care of him. Her thoughts about David and Jason show how much misunderstanding and fear there is surrounding people with mental disabilities, even for people who have grown up with someone with a mental disability. Catherine talks about how most people she knows don't need the rules. They just understand how to handle social interactions. She doesn't fully understand why David needs the rules, but she still makes them. The scene where Catherine puts her headphones on Jason's ears is amazingly written. The way she gets scared when she feels his hair. She's subconsciously afraid to touch him because she doesn't understand him and therefore is scared of him. She's not specifically scared of his wheelchair or communication book, but rather she's scared because his experience is so unknown to her. Obviously, her fear is irrational, but it's something that a lot of people experience due to a lack of understanding, and I think it's a very powerful thing to capture in a book. She doesn't acknowledge why she's afraid, but she does acknowledge the fear. Jason is the most important character in the book. He's the reason that Catherine stops being afraid of her brother, and he teaches Catherine to stop hiding from others and worrying about what they think. I think he's also a great depiction of someone who is non speaking. He's not presented as being dumb or unable to communicate, although if he was mostly unable to communicate, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing because it does take time to learn how to use an alternative method of communication. Jason is clearly capable of forming his own thoughts and demonstrates a complex personality through his communication using his book. He dreams of running but gets upset when Catherine draws him without his wheelchair. He likes talking to Catherine but doesn't like her drawing him without asking. He feels betrayed when he finds out that Catherine won't go with him to the dance because she's embarrassed, but he forgives her in the end and shows up to the dance anyway. He has many complex feelings and is clearly his own person despite being limited in his communication. This is another commonly misunderstood thing that is addressed through Catherine's character. At one point early in the story, after Jason gets upset because Catherine is drawing him, Catherine's mom suggests that she apologizes to him. Catherine doesn't want to because, quote, he can't answer me, unquote, to which her mom responds, quote, maybe he'll point to the answer in his book, or maybe he'll answer in his head, unquote. I think that last sentence is especially powerful. Just because someone can't speak, that doesn't mean that they can't understand you or find a way to communicate with you. And even if they don't seem to respond to you, that doesn't mean they aren't comprehending. It's still important to talk to them and treat them like a human. Catherine is afraid of and embarrassed by Jason on many occasions throughout the book, and it hurts Jason. But despite the hurt, he continues to forgive her because he can tell that she cares and is trying, and he's probably used to people acting like that around him. Catherine's parents are a very good depiction of what it's like to be the parent of a child with autism. They're doing their best to accommodate him and help meet his needs, but they weren't prepared for this, so they struggle. They have different views on what he needs, and that leads to conflict. Their dad is constantly late picking up David to go to the video store, even though it makes David upset. He's trying, but he often prioritizes work over his kids. He works so much so their mom can work from home, but despite being home most of the time, their mom is still often unable to help David. She puts Catherine in charge of babysitting him. The parents both love each other and their kids, but they're under so much stress that it can be hard to tell a lot of the time. This is something I've noticed quite a few times with parents of children with mental disabilities. It feels like a very realistic depiction. It's a situation that's hard on everyone involved, and it can be very difficult to find the right balance. Ryan sucks, and he makes me so upset, and that's intentional. I honestly don't think that Ryan is a bad person, he's just a kid, but because he doesn't understand people with mental disabilities, and likely as a result of behavior that he's now modeling from people older than him, he is rude and hurtful to David. He calls him mean names, makes fun of him, and excludes him from things. To make things worse, David doesn't realize that Ryan is making fun of him, and he views Ryan as one of his friends. The scene where Ryan makes David jump made me so angry that I teared up. Christy forms a very effective contrast to Ryan. Catherine tries to hide her brother from Christy because she doesn't want to scare her off. She's worried that Christy won't be understanding because so many other people haven't been. Christy, however, is much more understanding and accepting than Catherine expects. In some ways, she's even more accepting than Catherine is. The scene where Christy dances with David is very powerful and important. It impacted me as much as the jumping scene with Ryan, but in the opposite way. Catherine stops them from dancing because she thinks the way David dances is dumb. Quote, I don't like when people make David look stupid. End quote. But David was just having fun, and Christy pushes back, saying, quote, I asked him to dance. How is that making him look stupid? He liked it, didn't he? End quote. She understands that David does some things differently, and it doesn't matter to her. This challenges Catherine's views and shows the prejudices she's had without realizing. Christy once again challenges Catherine at the dance. Catherine didn't tell Christy that Jason's in a wheelchair or that he's non-speaking because she was embarrassed. Catherine says, quote, I should have told you the truth, end quote, and Christy responds with, quote, yeah, you should have, end quote, and walks away. This is the last interaction they have in the entire book. There are a couple ways to interpret this interaction, but based on the dancing scene with David, I think Christy is upset that Catherine was embarrassed by Jason because of how unfair it is to him. But despite generally being a very accepting person, she has her own flaws. The first and most obvious thing is that she's friends with Ryan. This is another thing that's very realistic. She's friends with someone who has some views that she disapproves of because she's afraid of not having friends. In a world where the majority of people are at least somewhat disrespectful toward people with special needs, it can sometimes be hard to find people who have the same views that you do. Also, she makes a comment to Catherine at one point about how, quote, even normal brothers are a pain, unquote, or something along those lines. While generally being a pretty understanding and accepting person, she doesn't always use the proper, considerate terminology, which is a very common thing. Every character is so well thought out and feels so realistic. They each have different levels of understanding and acceptance for people with special needs, and they each struggle with being accepting in different ways. All of these different struggles help Catherine to better determine which viewpoints she should align herself with and which she should avoid. This is a beautifully written and extremely powerful and impactful story about a neurotypical person addressing their internal prejudices and getting past their fears and misunderstandings around mental and physical disabilities. Whew. Okay, five more reviews. Here we go. And some of them are fairly short. Next is Travels with Charlie in Search of America by John Steinbeck. This book doesn't need much of a review, but it was a really great read and deserves to be more well known. It's a nonfiction narrative of John Steinbeck's travels across America with his dog in 1960. I love the writing style. The writing feels very personal without taking away from the broader picture of America being painted. There are lots of little lines throughout the book that are quite thought provoking and inspired my own writing in some ways. This book is particularly interesting if you have a general understanding of what was going on in America and the world at the time. We see Cold War tensions, racial tensions, and the emergence of various new technologies and consumerist culture, among other things. I was never particularly interested in American history until recently, but now I find this quite intriguing. The most interesting parts, in my opinion, are the conversations that Steinbeck has with various random people he meets. Some of the people are brief and curt, some are friendly and give lots of exposition about their own lives, and some are antagonistic, but they all add new details to the image being formed of America in 1960. Each section of the book feels unique and necessary while still connecting to the overall purpose of the novel. The final part was an especially unexpected and thought provoking ending. After spending the majority of the book focused on the beauty of different states and individual experiences, he ends by going to New Orleans. It is here that he witnesses firsthand the chaos and violence as Ruby Bridges arrives at her school. It didn't occur to me that that was happening at the same time that he was traveling, but it was engrossing to read his own account and analysis of things. That's the primary point of interest for the book, in my opinion. It's impossible for Steinbeck to show exactly what all of America is like or to make any sort of generalization. Instead, this book is interesting because we get to understand John Steinbeck better through his analysis of other people and experiences. I feel as though we learn just as much about the author as we do about America, and I enjoy books like that. And it's fascinating to see the similarities and differences of worldviews and ways of life across America. This was a really good book. I definitely recommend this book, particularly if you're interested in the history of America and want to see glimpses of the lives of various Americans in 1960. However, I think this book will teach you a lot, even if you don't think you have much of an interest in that subject. I would love to read more by Steinbeck. Next up is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which thankfully I do know how to pronounce that name. I'm pretty sure that was right. I started with this quote. There's no story that is not true. The world has no end, and what is good among one people is an abomination with others. End of quote. I've now read this book twice, and my description of what 5 out of 5 stars means definitely applies. I have probably brought this book up in discussions more than just about any other book. Anytime I talk about colonization, I always think about this book. The ending of this book is incredible, one of the best endings of any book I've read. It so quickly, simply, and effectively ties together everything you've read throughout the book without explicitly telling you what the point is. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I love the way it's written. Reading this book for the second time helped me notice just how much thought Achebe put into setting up the ending and the overall message of the story. To put it simply, the majority of the book is spent demonstrating the complexity of traditions and way of life in a specific Nigerian tribe before white Europeans attempt to colonize them. The Europeans view them as primitive, but every little detail and story that Achebe provides prior to that point tells the reader otherwise. While the Nigerians may be lacking in technology, there's a depth to their culture that the Europeans could never understand. There's an especially interesting book. This is an especially interesting book to read as a Christian. On the one hand, I'm glad to see more people being brought to Christ. As a Christian, I hope that as many people will be saved as possible. However, the missionaries sometimes treat the Nigerians harshly and counter their spiritual views. As a result, we see how challenging the Nigerians' religion causes their whole structure of life to fall apart. It's an extremely difficult challenge to spread the gospel without irreparably damaging their way of life, and this book does a great job of demonstrating that. This book is all about the complexity of life. It tackles the overall complexity of religion while simultaneously addressing the complexity present within every human. The main character, Okonkwo, is a harsh man. He beats his wives, yells at his children, and is very resistant to change. At times, it's hard to root for him. However, we also see that he secretly has a soft side. He loves Akimafuna, and rather than just caring about himself, we see that he truly cares most about the good of his tribe. That's why he acts the way he does at the end of the book. It's out of love for his tribe and his traditions. Although this is a fictional story, it is a very effective reflection of what truly happened during colonization. This book will give you a lot to think about and discuss. I highly recommend it. Next up, this is a very short. We have two very short ones left, and one that I don't remember. It's kind of in the middle, I think. This one is Juneteenth by Ralph Ellison. Ah. I was really hoping that this book would live up to the precedent set by Invisible Man, and I was not disappointed. This book will not be for everyone. Some people will definitely find it confusing or dislike the way it's written. I was confused too, but I thought this book was beautiful and one of the best written books I've read. There's not that much of a plot directly presented, but that contributes to the beauty of the book by leaving the reader to figure out a lot of things themselves. As a white person, I don't feel like I can comment much on this book, but it was a really interesting look into another culture, and I greatly enjoyed reading it. It's hard to find things to say about it. Essentially, this book is about a mixed but white presenting man who is raised by a black reverend, but eventually becomes a racist senator. After an assassination attempt, the senator reconnects with his foster father, and we see how he reached the point he's at through a series of long flashbacks that are not in chronological order, and some of which are simply dreamed scenarios. It's complicated but also poetic. If this sounds interesting, I highly recommend reading it. Just like Invisible Man, you have to stick with the book for a while before you can really start to appreciate it, but it's worth reading all the way through. Then we have the other Ralph Ellison book I've reviewed, Invisible Man, which also might be his only other book. I know he's written other things, but I think he only has two novels. This one's also really short. So here it is. An incredibly well written and culturally significant book. It's one of those books that's best to go into with no expectations or idea of what's to come. Essentially, the novel is about a young black man whose ideas of submission are challenged by the same people that he viewed as submissive. Through this increased awareness, he begins to form his own identity before coming to discover that his identity is still not his own. This book will stay with you for long after you read it. It took me a little while to get into, but it gets better and better the farther you get into it. I highly recommend this book. And a little plug here. I made an album that is like a concept soundtrack for basically the first half of Invisible Man. So check out ARO compositions on YouTube. At some point, I'm going to make Act Two for the rest of the story. And the final review is for The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. I read this book about a year ago, and it was my favorite book all the way up until about a month ago when I read Brave New World. So this is currently my second favorite book. It's incredible. Oh my goodness. I want to be clear, I read the unabridged version. I think this is a book that, like, I know some people don't want to read a like 1,300 page book or whatever, but I think you're really missing out if you read an abridged version. So here we go, the final review of this episode. Oh, we just passed the 2 hour mark. Let's go. Here we go. I understand that I've said some very positive and similar things about the previous books I've read, but I want to be very clear that this book is on a completely different level. It deserves as many stars as I could possibly give it. This has easily become my favorite book I've ever read before Brave New World. I can confidently say that this is the most interesting and well written story I have ever read. Dumas is an incredibly talented writer and storyteller who deserves to be remembered for the rest of time. I know I'm being very dramatic, but I can't help it. I truly don't understand how somebody could read the abridged version of this story. I feel sorry for them. I don't blame you if you do, but my advice is that the unabridged version is absolutely the best way to read this story. Despite being quite a long story, I did not get bored for a single moment. And that's saying something, apparently. I honestly don't know what I meant here. I don't get bored by books that easily, but whatever. There's not a single scene throughout the entire book that feels unnecessary. Seeing the way that every small scene throughout the story contributes to the conclusions and overall themes of the plot lines is one of the most interesting parts of the book. While this book has many aspects and themes such as betrayal, revenge, and even romance, it's also largely a mystery novel. The Count of Monte Cristo remains very mysterious throughout the story, but it's clearly demonstrated that he has a reason for everything he does. This leaves us with the mystery of trying to interpret each scene and figure out how it's going to tie into the story later and his overall plans. The character writing and choices made in which characters we follow throughout the story are perfectly done. Edmond Dantes is a kind, adored, ambitious, and sympathetic character that is easy to connect with. His backstory and personality are quickly and effectively established in a way that leads you to sympathize with everything he goes through. Count of Monte Cristo, on the other hand, is extremely mysterious, and much of what we learn about him, at least early on, is from the perspective of other people rather than himself. Rather than making us less interested in Monte Cristo, however, this only makes him more intriguing and makes each detail we learn about his plan become even more exciting. The writing of the other characters is just as impressive. Each character is given a thorough and important background that intertwines the lives of every character, even when they may not seem important at first. Some of these details don't seem important until they suddenly come back in a shocking revelation much later. Every character is believable and very well thought out. Each of the main enemies of Monte Cristo have different personalities and flaws and are problematic in different ways. They don't all feel like the same villain, but rather different individuals that have to be dealt with in different ways. I cannot express enough how amazing the story is. It is absolutely riveting and has so many shocking and powerful moments throughout. I was so invested in the lives and relationships of all these characters. Despite there being a pretty large number of characters, I was able to remember them all quite well because they were each given so much individual importance. I've never cried at a book before. This book made me cry on multiple occasions. I actually don't remember that. That's interesting. I cried after finishing the book, not because of anything in particular that happened at the end, but because I had been so engrossed in the story that it almost felt as though I'd lived it myself and I was overwhelmed by the emotions present within its resolution. Wow. That's like the highest praise from me. I'm starting to remember that now, but like yeah, no book has ever made me feel like that. Like I love this book. I'll finish this review before I continue. I love how the book doesn't just deal with the idea of revenge, but also the unexpected results of revenge on the additional people affected. I will never forget this book. I'm still a Jane Austen girly, but this is easily my favorite book. It's a long book, but I 100% recommend this to absolutely anyone. Anyone who will have the patience and motivation to read through this book should at least find something to take away from it. So yeah, I freaking love that the Count of Monte Cristo so much. Um, the main reasons why I put Brave New World higher, part of it's recency bias, because I read the Count of Monte Cristo a year ago and I just read Brave New World for the first time, but also just Brave New World is very compact and has so many great ideas and the most complex characters I've ever read about. And so, while I think The Count of Monte Cristo is absolutely incredible, Brave New World is like the most perfectly written book I've read, where it's like there's almost not a single word that feels unnecessary. And so for that reason, like I have to put it first. But they're both such amazing books. I highly recommend both of them, although The Count of Monte Cristo is much more of a commitment. Um, and that's it. So if you actually listen to this full 2 hours, then thank you very much for that. I hope some of the books sounded interesting. If any of them made you want to check them out, then totally do so. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of them. Or just if I talked about any books you've already read, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Um, and I mean that's it. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. And you can, subscribe and hit the bell if you want to listen to future episodes because I don't have a consistent schedule. So the only way to not miss out is to subscribe with notifications on. Or I guess just subscribe and check back every once in a while. But either way, thanks for listening and goodbye.